Alright everyone, hello and welcome to part 4 of my Punisher comic reviews, and part 3 looking at the original Punisher ongoing that ran from 1987 to 1995. It's me, Pyramid Head, back again, and I'm going to be covering issues 26 through 34 of that Punisher ongoing, as well as annual number 3. Now, you may have noticed that it's a shorter issue count than the other two parts, and I cut it off early at 8 issues and the annual because picking up after number 34 is the beginning of a 6-part story arc, and so I decided to save that for the next part and just make that one a little bit longer, because the way I try and do these videos is that I try to get it out in the increments of 12, so my goal for the first one was to issue 12, my goal for the second one was 24, and my goal for this one is 36, so I fell just short of that, and if I went on for 6 more issues, I would have gone way past that mark, and it would have been like, well, hell, what do I do for the next part? But, so yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that as to what that story is going to be at the end of this, but right now I'm going to jump into issue 24, so basically, Frank has come back from that last mission with the Shadow Masters and the ninjas and all that weird stuff, and issue 26, it's called like Operation Whistleblower or something like that, and he's watching TV because Frank Castle watches TV, and there's this news report about the Underwater Boat Company, which is this defense contractor who are making a nuclear submarine, but there's been all sorts of scandals about cost overruns, and the guy who runs, whose name is Morse, has been supposedly taking kickbacks and siphoning the funding away to other stuff, and so he has to go for a congressional hearing. And Frank takes an interest because he's a veteran and he doesn't approve of these ridiculous, defense funds and wasting of money. And when he's monologuing about this, he's talking about like all these different things cost and how he considers it unnecessary and too high. And all I could think of was Michael Douglas in Falling Down when he's in that convenience store and he's just smashing stuff because he thinks it's too expensive. That's what I was thinking of this whole time. Like, okay, Frank, you're a little bit crazier. And what's weird about this monologue is while he's doing it, he's talking about wasting money, and then he pulls out a dollar bill and just burns it, which is like, okay, you are now Krusty the Clown. And then he also, what was I going to say? There was something I was thinking of that he does here, where it's like, yeah, he burns a $1 bill, and he also mentions that if I paid taxes, which I don't, I'd also be very upset. And I'm like, never say that. Never talk about wasting of taxpayer money when you don't pay taxes, because it just makes you look like a tool. But okay, so he finds out there's this whistleblower whose name, it's either pronounced Weiss or Wise or Wheeze, and it's spelled like 3 different ways over the course of this. It's a 2-issue story arc, and it's spelled a bunch of different ways, so I'm just going to call him Wise. And he sets up a meeting pretending to be part of the General Accounting Office. And when he gets there, he finds that he's being attacked by thugs who were hired by Morse to kill him. And so he knocks one over with the bust-style door on the side of the battle van, which is pretty funny. And eventually he gets Wise away, and this continues the theme of this ongoing, where even though the Punisher is a matter of public record and Frank has been to prison multiple times, nobody knows who the hell he is. I'm just going to stop mentioning that during this video, because if I keep saying that, it's going to get ridiculous. I'll mention it here and there from now on, but not as much as I have been before. But okay, so he gets Wise back to like his warehouse hideout, and he's telling him that the Percival, which is this nuclear sub that they're building, tons of corners were cut, like substandard steel and faulty wiring, and it all passed inspection because Morse basically controls the whole system at this factory and pays people off, and apparently he lives like a king on all of the money skimmed off the top. He has like this expensive house in Virginia, even though the plant is in Connecticut, which is strange, but whatever. And so basically what happens at Wise, he dropped the files and the thugs picked them up as Frank got them away in the battle van. And so the thug, one of them ends up, it gets passed along to Morse, and Morse looks at it, he realizes that this is a copy, so he has them backed up somewhere, and so he says, okay guys, you have to keep going after them, because we don't need you to, we don't need him to, be spraying this out and get it to the subcommittee, which is basically what Wise's plan is. And also around this same time, he's like setting up a party at his house, and he says he wants like 18-year-old cheerleader-looking types for this senator. I think his name is Senator Power. Now, I forgot to go back and check if this is the same senator from not annual number 2, number 25, actually. It could be, because he has a very similar kind of cowboy aesthetic going on. But, I fucked up and didn't look back on that. And it's like, okay, that's kind of uncomfortable. And also, he's apparently going to ask his contacts at the Department of State and the CIA about Frank. And I think later on they come back and they have nothing on him, so even though Rikers Island held him multiple times, I'm just going to stop. And Frank and Wise, they bluff their way into the company's test area, saying that they're like safety inspectors, basically. And they go in there to steal, the other the backup copies of Wise's notes. But the guards catch on to them, and they have to escape into a small sub called a Piranha, which apparently this wasn't on the general records, because it's saying that underwater boat company, which is a seriously dumb name for a company, they are trying to keep it secret because they weren't supposed to be spending money on it or something. And so they escape and they blast through a steel door with the sub's torpedoes and they head for the open ocean. And this whole time it's like, you can't fire a torpedo in here. No, you can't take this thing. That would be stealing. And Wise is just being kind of funny. And so they're heading out for an open ocean. And meanwhile, while all this is going on, Punisher just randomly inner monologues about the fact that criminals killed my family, so I kill criminals. It's like Mike Baron, who's still writing this, he figured he had to put in the Punishers, because that happens in a few issues here and there, but it's usually towards the beginning or in a place where it makes sense. Here it's just completely random. And so they're driving around, they send up the sub's communications array, and they get into contact with Morse, and Frank is like, hey, I want you to tell me what you did and say it for sure. But Morse hangs up, and he has government and military cronies, including a fleet admiral. And they decide to track the Piranha and send the Percival after it and finds them. And the last panel of this issue is just the massive Percival just hanging over the tiny Piranha, and it's like, holy crap. It's a great ending. Now, this first issue was okay. It was an interesting enough setup and different enough from the typical Punisher story to be worth telling, but where it goes in the second issue is kind of awesome, because moving on to number 27 basically turns into the Hunt for Red October, so that actually would not have been out yet, I don't think, when this issue was published. This would have been 89 or maybe very, very early in 90. I don't think Red October was out until further into that year, so he was clearly planning this. I think Mike Baron must have seen that was coming out and decided to do a similar kind of story. And so Frank, because the communications basically are jammed for the Piranha, they can only send the underwater communications between subs, so he communicates with the Percival, and he bluffs, once again, the crew into thinking he's a Russian spy looking to defect. But he's really planning to take over the Percival, and as he says it, he's going to aim one of the nukes at Morse's house and take him out, which is like, wow. So, at Morse's place, we see the senator getting an implied blowjob from one of the teenage hookers in exchange for getting funding sent over to Morse. And I looked at this panel. It is very clear the implication, because it's it cuts off at his stomach, and you can see the hair on the back of her head just at the bottom of the frame. It's like, wow, there's a blowjob in a mainstream Marvel comic from 1989 or early 90. Wow. And then the fact that the Piranha wasn't shot down, they actually got into contact with the captain of the Percival. That information gets relayed to Morse by Fleet Admiral Fairfax, who's one of his cronies. And he also says that he has a special agent on board the Percival who will kill Punisher and Wise for them. And what's interesting about this is that, okay, for one thing, we have Punisher going up against a very highly placed, corrupt governmental and military figures, like a cabal of these guys, which A, would get picked up later on in the Max series, and there would be an ongoing story arc about that. And B, that's kind of what he's going up against in the Netflix series. Interesting parallel there. And also the agent on board the submarine, that's totally a thing taken from Hunt for Red October. Only here he never actually comes into play, whereas in the movie he does. Granted, he only comes into play in the last, 10 minutes. It is a thing. And now Frank does this thing where I'm not really sure it would work, so he basically gets both subs to surface. And he basically gets the guys who come over in the dinghy to pick up. He says, hey, go over to the other side. And it's basically a trick so that the people on board the Percival don't see him knocking these guys out and leaving them on top of the Piranha. But I'm like, okay, the Percival is 10 times as big with a big-ass conning tower on top. How is this gonna work? But it does. He overpowers them, and he puts himself and Wise inside two of their wetsuits, and they take the captain hostage, and they order them to send out a message where Wise just starts broadcasting his dirt on Morse over commercial frequencies, and then once again, we get a jam on all frequencies from Maine to Maryland. And all but the Admiral agree that the Percival itself is expendable, so they're planning on destroying this thing. I got the order of the jamming of communications wrong. It didn't happen till now, sorry. I'm going off of my notes. And so Frank, he has the Percival submerged, and Wise switches over to a special naval frequency. Just before another sub, the Casey shows up and jams that. And the fact that the Casey won't communicate convinces the captain that something isn't right. Their hull starts to flex because the substandard steel. And this is what gets the captain to kind of get on Frank's side, and he's like, okay, arm the nukes and input the coordinates set to Morse's house. And with the idea that the Casey, which is like tracking their every move, won't shoot at the armed nukes, which is a really clever plan. And this catches the president's attention, who calls up the Admiral, gets put in touch with the Percival, and they explain the situation. And so they get patched into the Casey. The president gets patched into the Casey, and they say that Fairfax was behind it. President calls Fairfax, tells him to stay where he is, and that Marines are on their way to arrest all of them. The senator is tipped off to get the hell out of there, and then Fairfax just pulls out a gun and just kills himself, which is kind of dark. And I'm assuming Morse gets arrested. It never actually gets specified. And so the threat to the Percival is ended, and then Frank and Wise are given this water sled to go back to the Piranha, saying that they're going to disarm, because there's like this explosive on it that will get set off if anyone messes with it. And so basically what they do is that they say they're going to go to the Piranha, but they wait, basically do is that they head for shore, and basically they wait for, the guys who are left on the Piranha to get taken off, and then they blow it up to kind of cover their escape. And then Frank helps Wise create a new identity, and that's the end. Overall thoughts on this arc, I'm glad to be seeing, the 2-issue arcs coming back. I think those tend to be a little bit stronger than at least compared to, the second string of issues where it was basically 2, 5-issue arcs with, there was, one and done thrown in there, and, or however long that Shadow Master story was, because it started off feeling like a one and done with the boxing stuff, and that just kept going and going. And there was a single one and done in there somewhere. But the Kingpin thing went on for a while. I think the Vegas story was in the middle. And then there was the Shadow Master story, which actually, looking at the letters pages for one of these comics, apparently the Shadow Masters, I was right about the backdoor pilot thing, because they got either a one-shot comic to themselves or a very brief miniseries. Which, given the fact that I don't think hardly anyone has heard of the Shadow Masters, I think that goes to show just how well that went over. And so we move on to another 2-issue arc, which this time it's Dr. Doom versus the Punisher. Holy crap, this story, that alone is just hype-worthy. And so this thing starts off really weird. Basically, there's this weird multi-sided conference room, which is said to be in a pocket dimension or something, and it has this weird sign on the wall, spin the wheel and get a dance partner or something, so it's a weird speed dating thing for villains, I guess. And so Kingpin and Dr. Doom both enter this thing, and Kingpin talks about how he has this interdimensional friend who set up this meeting for reasons which aren't explained. And that's one thing about this story, because it feels like there's a whole bunch of greater context things from other books going on around it that's just never really explained. And so Kingpin, they're talking, and then Doom gets really arrogant and says, you can't even squat a puny insect like the Punisher. And Kingpin's yeah, he's just a nuisance to me, really, which has been proved twice at this point. But Dr. Doom's I must prove my superiority and kill the Punisher. And so, okay, Frank goes to meet he sets up a meet with a gun runner who's bringing guns in from Canada over the border into Maine, and they're meeting in this rock quarry. And he goes to meet them. He goes ahead of time. And then behind him, Doom just touches down, because Doom can fly, I guess, as part of his robot suit. He goes, "Haha, it was me all along. I posed as that guy to meet up with you, and I'm going to destroy you." And also there's a 1 week time. The Kingpin's I'm going to give you a week to do this, or something like that. He takes out Doom with this massive cannon or gun thing that pops out of the top of the battle van. And it turns out he's just one of Doom's Doom bots. And then a Latvian tank shows up and traps Frank in the quarry, so the only thing he can do is leave the battle van behind and just escape with a jetpack. And so he reconvenes with Micro, and so they decide they want to, get leverage against Doom by stealing something that he prizes. And so they decide to, so they look up how there's this special Fabergé egg that he stole from Soviet Russia himself. that's in his art gallery in his castle in Latveria. So they sneak over the border into Latveria. And while this is going on, Doom attacks, what he thinks is Frank's hideout and blows it up. And I think they had gotten out of there, but they had vacated that warehouse by then. And so Frank is infiltrating the castle through the sewer pipes, as you do, comes into the basement. There's a giant robot guard that he kills, he destroys, somehow silently. And then there's a human guard just standing there taking a smoke, and I'm like, I don't think Frank would just kill this guy on just meeting him, because, he's not trying to hurt him. And last I checked, working for the legitimate ruler of your country was not considered a crime. Like, yeah, I know Doom's a dictator and he can be brutal and stuff, but last I checked, he is a legitimate world leader. Maybe in the 90s he wasn't. I don't know my comic history of Doom that well. I like the Dr. Doom character. I don't know that much about him. And also I should mention there's this whole thing where Kingpin mentions that Doom had been kicked out of Latveria. And that's where this thing starts to get confusing. But so he takes the dead guard's clothes, sneaks into the art vault where he grabs the egg and then gets confronted by 3 different Dooms, and he explains what's going on. And then one of them steps out and claims to be the real Doom, and that the one that was going after Frank was a renegade Doombot. That's a pretty interesting twist. And it gets really goddamn complicated from here. So, moving on to issue number 29. The real Doom allows Frank to stay at his guest, and they're eating dinner together, and he offers him the job of taking out the Renegade. And while this is going on, the Renegade and the Kingpin are colluding, and there's this whole thing about how Kingpin is pushing for superhero registration. Never really amounts to a whole lot, so I'm guessing that was something bigger that was going on in the Marvel Universe at the time. So Civil War before Civil War was a thing. Probably better than Civil War because Mark Millar wasn't writing it, but I digress. And not trusting the real Doom, Frank breaks out of the castle by stealing a helicopter and picks up Micro. They're forced to land at an airbase by S.H.I.E.L.D. He gets a tongue lashing from a hologram communication of Nick Fury, which was awesome. Getting to see Nick Fury show up. He's like, if there wasn't all this shit going on with registration and international crime wave, I'd fucking arrest you right here and there. But he lets them go. They fly back to New York, and Frank reveals that he stole a painting from the vault. And it's rolled up in a tube, and he wants to get a forgery made by like this artist that he knows. And it's pretty easy to guess what the painting is, because earlier on, like, Doom was going like, this is this was a painting I had made by my mother and my father. And I'm like, that's what Frank stole. And so they get the thing forged, and they drive around town with the forgery on top of the band, getting the renegade Doombot's attention. And they end up running, and the way he does it, he runs to like this massive superhero battle taking place outside the Guggenheim, and I just keep expecting fucking Will Smith and that alien guy to show up on the roof during this part, but they don't, from the beginning of Men in Black. And so I guess that's part of the larger scale thing that's going on. So they meet with this renegade Doom on the pier. This is where it gets really silly. It's like, we get this reveal that the renegade is the real Doom after all, and one in Latveria is like a young dude named Christoph who somehow has all of Doom's memories. And Doom agrees to lay off of Frank in return for the real painting, but after Frank goes, he's like chuckling to himself, going like, ha ha ha, Christoph made no deal, so he'll still come after him. And that's the end of that story arc. I liked it. It was fun. It was just fun seeing the Punisher square off with someone like Dr. Doom, because you don't see that all that often. And so I had fun with that. The problem is that, I'm not really sure about all the twists that are going on. Like, so was Doom forced out? And if he was forced out of his country, but they're still being ruled by a fake Dr. Doom, and the fake Dr. Doom makes an interesting point of, why would I, like, bow down to someone like the Kingpin? I wouldn't need to prove my superiority because I know I'm superior. I don't need to prove it. Which sounds like a kind of Doom-like thing to me based on the little that I know. So why would he bother with this thing? Like, and who was setting this shit up behind the Kingpin? Like, there's this dude who's following Dr. Doom around who has like a widow's peak and is smiling like a jackass the whole time. Like, is that supposed to be Mephisto in like a more subtle guise? Like, not with like the cape and everything? But I don't know, maybe that could just be a Dr. Doom crony I don't know anything about. But I'm like, was Mephisto behind all of this for some reason? I don't know. But it was good. I liked seeing another fairly strong 2-issue, like not strong but entertaining 2-issue arc. Now, number 30 is a one and done called Confession, I believe. And it's set around Christmas actually, so I guess this is still 89, with Frank going to church and going to confession. And he's talking to the priest about all these things he's done, and the priest, who's kind of figured out who he is based on what he said and because he watches the news, tells him there's a man who comes in, he confesses to being a serial killer known as the Bayside Butcher. Now, the Bayside Butcher is a serial killer who kills women and hacks off their body parts and then dumps the bodies, and we don't know what. And so Frank, agrees to this. And he has Micro put a camera facing the church door. He talks about possibly bugging the confessional booth, but it sounded like they're going to do that, but that never comes up. But they do definitely put a camera across the street from the church. And now Frank's like, I can't even go to church in this neighborhood anymore, which is kind of sad. Like, he considered it like this one quiet place he could go to, and now he can't. And also he makes an offhand mention of the fact it's the only church he knows of that has a wax statue of Jesus holding a Bible. That's important for later. Another body is found somewhere in Pennsylvania, and this is part of the plot I'm not real keen on. It feels like issue filler. And Frank heads to this place to talk to the detective in charge, who, based on his history, Frank thinks he'll help him. And so he gets these details, and that there's like this geltate, I forget what it's called. There's like this substance that was found on one of the bodies, which one of the main uses of it is for making dental molds. And so Frank thinks he's like a dentist or a dental technician. And so he gets information on dentists acquired by Micro, cross-references it with the photos taken outside the church, and this leads him to a guy named Neese, who moved to New York from Arizona because he was disgraced for taking advantage of patients while they were under the gas in the dental office. And Frank tails him to the Bronx, tries to save him from two drug dealers he was buying from. He has to save him from two drug dealers he was buying from. So he drives him off in his car, threatens the man, gets physical with him, but then realizes that he's not the guy just off of pure instinct. And he looks up, this is where it gets a little bit more ridiculous as well. So he looks over at a poster for a wax museum, and he remembers, oh, this material is also used for modeling. So he goes to this wax museum, and my problem with this part is that it's just so coincidental. I think he maybe could have found that in a different way, and I also don't get why we needed to have the whole thing with the cop in Pennsylvania either. That doesn't really add up to much. But so he goes to the wax museum, and he breaks in, and he finds out that the guy who works there has been using the limbs of the dead women to make a perfect Joan of Arc model, so that means this whole issue is basically a giant reference to the movie House of Wax starring Vincent Price, where he's using dead people to make wax models, and the big centerpiece is Joan of Arc. So it's interesting. So Frank chases him through the museum. He shoots him, wounds him, and he's bleeding. And the guy says, hey, you should go talk to the doctors at this clinic. This doctor at this clinic, he argued I shouldn't be let go, but they let me go anyway. And then Frank just puts him down. Bam, bam, bam. And I like that moment because it almost seemed like the killer was saying, yeah, I really should have stayed locked up, but there was some failing in the system and I got turned out anyway. I felt like that was saying something kind of interesting and deep necessarily, but it was an interesting sort of comment on how sometimes things get fucked up. But I like that. And then, so Frank, after this happens, Frank also says, oh, call up the cop and tell him to check this place or something like that. So that's all that happens from that subplot with the cop in Pennsylvania. And so Frank, he goes back to the church looking for the priest. And he finds out from a nun that the priest renounced his vows and got transferred to a missionary in Africa to work as a layperson. And then the nun also tells him, they mentioned before he left that the wax statue of Jesus was a gift from a certain young man, but he wouldn't say who it was. And then Frank looks over at it, and there's like this bit in his inner monologue where he says, better not look too closely. The implication being that this statue of Jesus is a fucking dead person made into a wax statue of Jesus. And I read that and was like, wow, that was a dark note to end on. Overall thoughts on this issue, like I said, it felt like there's a little bit of issue filler there, like getting into contact with the cop in Pennsylvania. I don't know why that was necessary, because, I mean, he already was setting up stuff around the church. Like, God only knows why they bring up bugging the confessional booth and, like, seriously consider it when they don't just... Because if he had done that and put the camera outside, he would be able to cross-reference it and end this plot much quicker. And him finding out that the wax museum was where to go, and that specific wax museum at that, was a little ridiculous. And also the whole House of Waxing was kind of silly, but made totally worth it by that ending. But overall, I thought it was a very good one and done, and I liked it. I thought it was a nice, moody little story about Frank hunting a serial killer. Now, moving on to the next two-issue arc, we have Frank going to Arizona to track down motorcycle gangs dealing in, they say, both meth and speed at multiple times in this, so I'm starting to think Mike Baron doesn't know that much about drugs to know they're two different things. And so he's going to infiltrate a gang called Satan's Lords, and he actually grows out a beard, is riding a motorcycle. And I remember when I first saw the Dolph Lundgren film, and I'm like, why is Frank a biker in this? But having read these comics now, it's like, he'll ride whatever. It's not really a problem. I don't even know why I had a problem with that. But he's got his beard growing out, and he's got like like a motorcycle jacket on. And on the back of it is the Punisher skull, only covered in flames. I don't know if that was meant to be a sneaky in-joke by the artist to reference Ghost Rider, or if Frank just knows who Ghost Rider is and went, I'll put that on the back of my jacket. It's kind of like my symbol. And so basically what he wants to do is that he's created like his own version of meth or speed or whatever. It's like this really high-grade version, and he's hoping to play them off against their rivals who are called the Galloping Geese. Yeah, real tough fucking sounding group of bikers there. But no, the Satan's Lords is the gang he's infiltrating, which is kind of cool. And this whole time, I'm just thinking of Breaking Bad, because he's in the Southwest with a very pure type of drug. He's like the amazing cook. Heisenberg meets fucking Punisher, I guess. And so while Frank is in the camp talking to their leader, Heck, I forget Heck's last name because all I've written in my notes is Heck. You know, the Galloping Geese attack while Frank is there, and they escape. You know, they get a truck off of a local man because we find out later that Heck is considered kind of a Robin Hood figure, and they meet Heck's woman who's, I'm not sure if she's his wife or his girlfriend, because they never really specify. He just calls her my old lady, which can be used to mean both. And so it turns out, Heck, he uses the funds from meth to finance a war on developers because, you know, he's Hopi Indian. He doesn't like them destroying the land that he feels belongs to his people. So he's like an environmental saboteur. And so Frank is kind of like weighing his options, not sure what he thinks of this guy. And they're planning to set up a new lab at his wife's ranch. And they mention that you know, the wife or girlfriend, Holly, they say at multiple times that this guy is her father and her ex. This just feels like an editorial oversight, but this guy called Austin Lang, who's a big time developer, that Heck helped her get away from him, and that he's been, because it was like a bad relationship or something. At times like I said, at times they say he's her father, at times they say he's her ex-husband, but it turns out he's hiding in the back of the truck with the chemicals in it. He gets into a fight with Frank, and Heck, who's been getting high off his own supply, gets paranoid. He thinks Frank and Holly are allied with this guy, locks the two of them in the back of the truck, and drives off. What am I, Ralph fucking Wiggum? Oh, wait, to be continued. So far, it's an alright story. Not that much to it, as you can tell, but it's got some interesting things, like Frank maybe kind of, you know, considering maybe getting rid of this guy isn't such a, maybe this guy has like his positive qualities, but then of course the drugs come in, he just goes crazy. Okay, so issue number 32 begins with Austin Lang and Frank. They try to get the door of the trailer open, and I was a little confused as to what happened here. Either Frank falls out the back, or either jumps out the back, or Austin knocked him out, but Austin Lang stays behind, gets around to the cab to get into a tussle with Heck. Holly jumps out of the cab just in time, and the truck goes over a cliff and explodes. So they're dead, right? Also, in 80s stuff, every car explodes just from getting tapped. Just watch Death Wish 3 if you want an example of that. But so, some of the geese, they show up led by their leader, Wild Bill. Frank trips them up with some piano wire, and Holly's like, well, you can't kill them. He's like, no, I'm just going to knock over their motorcycles. And I'm like, good, because this was getting dangerously close to the counselor when he pulled this shit off. I don't need to be reminded of that piece of shit. But they head back to the ranch on foot, and Frank catches and bags a rattlesnake on his way. Sadly, he does not punch it in the face like Van Damme does in Hard Target. That would have been hilarious. And so they get there, and they find that the Galloping Geese have occupied the ranch, and he gets attacked by he goes to try and sneak in and gets attacked by Wild Bill, and he throws the bagged snake at the gang, and they start freaking out. And he's like running around fighting all these guys, and he makes the meth lab, he like shoots at the meth lab and makes it explode. And this is where the story gets really silly, because Heck turns up alive, badly injured and out of his mind on the drugs, and threatening both Frank and Holly. He has them at gunpoint. And then Austin Lang shows up riding a motorcycle, runs over Heck and flattens him, and then drives right into the burning remains of the meth lab. And Holly and Frank are standing there, and it's like, well, what are we going to do about this? And that's the ending. 2-issue arc, entertaining, had some good action, Had some interesting story ideas. The ending was so silly and ridiculous, it was even more entertaining as a result. I liked it. Next up in sequence is 33 and 34, which is another 2-issue arc. And it's basically the Punisher versus the Reavers, aka common X-Men villains, like cybernetic guys who hate the X-Men and try and kill mutants and stuff. And they're apparently, according to this, their headquarters are in Australia. And so Micro basically just opens is that Micro is like he's like tracing a shipment of like cybernetic bioweapons, and he traces it. It's in New York, and he traces it back to Australia to the Reavers hideout and doesn't know it's them. And so their security systems, they attack Micro's and the Punisher systems at their base. They just completely wipe their files, which thankfully are backed up, and shut the entire system down so they can't turn on their defenses or anything. So basically they get the garage door open, take the battle van away and park it somewhere, move all of their ordnance out except what they need to fight, and then they wait there for these guys to show up. And the leader of the Reavers, who is Pierce, Donald Pierce, the aka one of the bad guys from Logan, the guy Boyd Holbrook played, he's like, he has minions named Bonebreaker, Reese, and Pretty Boy to hunt them down. Bonebreaker is like half tank. Pretty Boy is like a dude with like a handsome face, and the rest of him is a robot. And Reese, I don't know what the fuck to think of him. He's just weird looking. And Lady Deathstrike is there, and she's like, I want to go with. And Pierce is like, no, I'd rather keep you here. And then there's like a scene later on where you don't really see it, but they're clearly fucking, which is pretty funny. And then the Reavers attack, and like Micro has this weird like Dalek battle tank thing, which is holding off the Reavers for a while, but that gets destroyed. And then they flee via raft into the sewers. And Pretty Boy, who has like these extending arms, plants a tracker on the raft, and so the Reavers follow them to the river. And they riddle the raft with bullets, and Frank and Micro go under the water and don't surface, so they're like, hey, we got him. That's like the cliffhanger. So far, this isn't much of like a story, but it's an entertaining action piece. There's this cool action of Frank and Micro's Dalek fighting the Reavers, and the Reavers themselves are just kind of interesting to look at because of their weird designs and extreme personalities. And so, issue number 34 starts with the Reavers searching the river for a bit, and then the police show up, and they don't want to start a scene there, so they flee, and they head for Pierce's penthouse in New York. Frank and Micro, who somehow escaped using scuba tanks, don't ask me how, they head to Micro's cousin Elliot's junkyard in Queens, because Elliot is a bit of a weapons dealer on the side. He has this broken down cybernetic exoskeleton in his junkyard sitting around, and Frank and Micro fix it up. And Micro, he tracks the Reavers to Pierce's penthouse and hacks the computer there, tipping off their location, which I believe was done on purpose. And so they show up. Frank is fighting off the Reavers with the exoskeleton. Eventually, he drives them away by self-destructing it after he gets out. And they attempt to contact Pierce during this, but like I said before, he's too busy having sex with Lady Deathstrike to pick up the phone, which is pretty funny. And Elliot gets killed in the crossfire, and Micro's all broken up about it. But Frank's inner monologue is going on, and he says that doesn't he realize that I would have had to kill this guy myself if he survived, because this is the kind of guy I'm fighting my war against, which was an interesting note to end this kind of silly Punisher versus mutant hunters, because nobody actually knows who this guy is. Like, and this isn't my complaint about nobody knowing who the Punisher is. Like, they don't seem to know who they're going after when they track down this warehouse. They just think some mutants tried to hack in, and then they find out that he's not a mutant, and they still try and kill him, which I find kind of funny. But I thought it was a fun, just dumb fun action story, which happened to end on this really somber and interesting note, which it doesn't really fit, but I thought it kind of worked. Now, moving on to annual number 3, and I'll talk about why I didn't go further with the regular issues after I'm done with it, but moving on to annual number 3, the first story is called The Programma Strain, because we have to reference the Andromeda Strain, I guess. And its Punisher is going after this biotech company called Programma, and they're making bioweapons for AIM, the think tank, which is secretly run by MODOK, I believe in the comics, and it was in Iron Man 3, being run by Guy Pearce. And so it's like they're under a contract to make this thing for AIM, and then they're planning to steal them, and there's a break-in from someone who's working for AIM, and he confronts the AIM scientists on site. He's interrogating one who says that the agent hasn't returned, that they're hired by this guy called Jethro Prufrock, who's a presidential candidate. He's super wealthy, and he And he believes in stockpiling weapons and stuff like that. And Punisher is apparently thinking about investigating him due to something with credit card fraud, but that never actually gets explained or gone into detail on. And then this weird deformed man breaks in and attacks them, killing the scientist and catching Punisher off guard right after this is revealed. So Frank eventually escapes the area after fighting some guards. And he's heading to Prufrock's house in Connecticut. So this is the second time he's been in Connecticut in this string of issues I've been reading. Excuse me. And so he's going in there, and he bluffs his way into the estate posing as an animal control guy looking for a rabid dog. Sneaks into the house, he climbs in through the bathroom window, and he literally in his inner monologue goes, "I came in through the bathroom window," as a Beatles reference. Somehow Frank doesn't strike me as a Beatles guy. And so he's listening to Prufrock talk to his daughter Martha. And they sum up what we've known so far, that he hired these AIM guys to steal this thing. And then we find out that the deformed man is his son George, who somehow got exposed to the bioweapon, and that apparently it's not stable, but he's telling Martha, "Oh, this will work perfectly, then the enemy soldiers will tear each other to pieces." And then Punisher bursts into the fucking room and kills Prufrock's dog, which is just like, it wasn't lunging at him, it wasn't attacking him, and it's certainly not a criminal. I don't think of Frank as a guy who would just kill an animal because it's there. That's just fucked up. And I'm not normally someone who complains about dogs dying and stuff, because frankly I think it's silly that there's a whole website dedicated to that, so that little sissies don't get surprised by it. But reading this, it just seems tasteless that Frank would shoot a dog that wasn't even trying to bite him, let alone doing anything at all. And so there's some things happening where he has them at gunpoint. Prufrock pretends to have a heart attack or something so that he can sneak a gun out from under his chair. A gun's attached to his foot or something. So he can bend over, grab it, and try and shoot at Frank, and that gives Martha enough time to run away. And they're fighting in the room, and there's this weird thing about, you can't just kill a presidential candidate. He thinks Frank is a Russian agent for some reason. And Frank's just saying, well, what about what happened to JFK? And I'm like, is Frank seriously implying that JFK was killed by Russian spies? And so you have this weird conversation going on. And AIM attacks, they fight Prufrock's guards, and I think they all kill each other off. And then George bursts in, fighting both of them, and kills his father. Martha comes back with a shotgun, and she shoots him, knocks him down, but it does, because his skin is bulletproof to most bullets, but it just knocks him down. She takes him to her father's armory, where he pulls out an anti-tank weapon and blows George off a seaside cliff. And it's actually mentioned at some point during this that he was the agent who snuck in to steal the bioweapon and tested it on himself to prove something to his father. I don't know what, but whatever. And it says that the story continues in the Daredevil annual. And it says on the cover it's part 1 of 4 of Lifeform. So I'm guessing AIM's involvement in this storyline, or AIM, or whatever you want to call them. There's some sort of overarching story across the different annuals involving AIM. So once again, I don't know. I'm not going to read the rest of those, so I don't know what the whole story is. But unlike the other two, this felt like more of a contained story, because the first one was Punisher is fighting these weird robot things that are tied into something. And then the second one was the Punisher was fighting snake people with Moon Knight, and it had something to do with Conan that wasn't really explained, and the Serpent God Set and Robert E. Howard's snake people. Okay. And then we get, but this felt more self-contained than those did. Those just felt like random moments. And so the next thing we get is we get a series of little short stories demonstrating Frank's hand-to-hand combat. Just like we got in the annual number 2. And it's showing him doing all these different techniques, and a few of them were kind of fun. There was one where he's fighting a mugger who goes in and tries to kick him, and he goes he's been watching too many Van Damme movies. I'm sure Dolph Lundgren would agree. And there's a few fun things throughout there of him just beating up these thugs in different ways. And there's a moment where he gets picked up by two mafia goons who are trying to drag him over to a car, and he just slams their heads together and says 2 heads are better than 1, which is pretty funny. And the next segment of this annual is a series of full-page panels just dedicated to different guns in the Punisher's arsenal and all the details about them and why Frank likes a certain gun and what his modifications are. And it was pretty entertaining to read. Like, I find guns and the details of guns and different varieties and whatnot to be an interesting subject. Yeah, it is unapologetic gun porn, but it was just entertaining to read. And it was interesting to note that Frank says that his one true love is the 1911 Cult, was something that did get picked up by the 2004 movie. So yeah, that was fun. And then there's a very short story where the Punisher gets led into hell. It's called Foretold or Forewarned. One of those two. Forewarned or Foretold. Where he's going into hell and he meets the Kingpin, who's this giant demon who's like laughing at him saying, ha ha ha, I'm gonna get... He's monologuing and shit saying, oh yeah, we're in the same place now. And then like he gets attacked by like these women demons who overwhelm him. Turns out it was a dream and he pops out of it. He's going like, yeah, maybe someday I'll get to hell, blah, blah, blah. But I won't get overwhelmed like that. I'll be prepared even for that, basically. It was okay. It was a decent enough concept. There wasn't enough really pages or anything. And like the way it was executed wasn't that great. So yeah, it was an interesting idea that wasn't really done justice. I will say that the art when he wakes up is really atmospheric and really great. I liked it a lot. And then we get, as we do in these annuals, we get a short story called Philanthropy, which is a micro story, where he moves into a new apartment. He sees this old woman named Mrs. Rosen. She lives across the street. He sees her collapse. He goes to help her, and he finds out she's short on food because this phony charity bilked her out of her money. And so Micro figures out who they are, tracks them down to an office in Houston, and then he proceeds to systematically just completely destroy and dismantle this operation. Like, he pretends to be like a repair, like he basically hacks into their computers and screws them up, pretends to be a repair guy, and while he's fixing them, he gets all the information he needs, wipes everything, sends out the information publicly, and he also puts crazy glue in like the lead guy's gun. So he gets confronted by one of the people he bilked, who pulls a gun on him, and he pulls his gun, pulls the trigger, and it blows up in his face, and Micro's just laughing about it as he listens to the bug he planted in his office. Fun little story. It was cool seeing Micro be smart and kick ass in his own way. So yeah, this stretch of Punisher issues, overall, I think it was stronger than the last stretch because it wasn't like a bunch of lengthy story arcs that weren't that great, and like the Kingpin one was fairly good, and then it just ended on a note. And then the Shadow Master story felt like it was cobbled together as they went along. But this, on the whole, was actually, it was a lot better because I think I think Mike Baron, he's not a bad writer, but I think his strengths are more suited to these shorter stories as opposed to the longer ones. But maybe I'll see something later on that will change my mind about that. And hopefully it's soon, because basically the reason why I cut it short at 8 issues in the annual instead of 12 or 13 as they were on the other two is because the next story coming up, and it was advertised at the end of that last issue of 34, it's a 6-part story about Jigsaw. Anyone who has listened to me talk about the Punisher knows I don't care that much for Jigsaw. So hopefully seeing Mike Baron write the character will actually bring him, bring it, and I'll actually like the character this time as opposed to just being kind of indifferent to just outright not liking him. So I'm looking forward to that. So basically what my plan is that I'll do that 6-part story, and then I'll try and bring it up to the next 12 increment to 48, see how far past that I need to go, and then do the 4th annual. But I'm thinking in between that, I'll do one of the one-shots or graphic novels I have on hand from this period. And because I was talking earlier about doing the 89 Punisher movie adaptation, which is 1990, so roughly around this time frame, I'm thinking since the movie itself didn't come out until since it was an 89 movie that didn't get released here until, in America at least, until 1991, it's straight to video on that at least, I can hold off on that adaptation for just one more. And I think in between this there's one called Return to Big Nothing, which is written by Stephen Grant, who did Circle of Blood. So I think I'll read that and do that as like an in-between thing before I go into this next big chunk of issues. So yeah, that was the 3rd part of the Punisher ongoing. I had fun reading it and recording this, and I hope you had fun listening. So until next time, bye.